speak louder. All right, thank you very much for being here. So my name is Anthony. I'm a senior software engineer at Algolia. I won't talk to you about Algolia specifically today. It's not the goal. But today I want to show you a bit of all the tips and tricks, the do's and don'ts, everything that I learned working with Go in my company. As you will see, I work mainly as I will talk as a maintainer nowadays, but in the past I was mainly writing production code. So thanks to these both experiences, I hope you'll learn a few things and could probably apply it by the end of this talk. All right, so I've been writing Go for a few years now. I really love computer science. I'm still learning things and I'm also teaching it. So it's pretty much everything that relates to that. You can talk to me about it after the talk. I'm super interested. This is also why I've joined a company that is doing a search engine. It's super challenging, super interesting. I also like to travel. And what I mean by travel is not the one that you put on your resume. It's also the fact that I love to travel between different technologies. You'll see that later. So, let's take the example of a search as a service, because this is what I'm doing at my company. Just to give you a bit of insights of what we are doing. We are building a search engine that you don't install on your computers or servers. We are not in the 2000s anymore. It's provided as a service, so it's behind an API. And to let our user access these search services, we are building Go and for many other programming languages, we are building API clients. So what I want you to keep in mind here is that we are not only providing those API clients to connect to a regular service with the CRUD operations where everything is known in advance. We are also providing tools that let you push your data, which means arbitrary data that we don't know in advance. Okay. So today we are going to see a few topics. The two main ones I want to convince you about are the limitations that we have in Go, especially in comparison with other programming languages, but also how to counter them. And finally, I'll show you that even if sometimes Go may feel a bit unexpressive, we can still provide a very good developer experience in Go. Thing is, spoiler, you have to be doing more work on your side than for your users. All right, so let's talk about maintenance versus regular usage, production code. This is what I usually say. As I told you, in the past, I was mainly a user of Go, so I was importing dependencies. I was the user of external dependencies, and I was pissed off by the job of other library authors. So I'm just joking a bit here, but this is really this was really the state before. I was relying on someone else's job, so I was relying on external dependencies to do my job every day. And I've been doing that for 2.5 years mainly, working with GCP services and other things. At the time, I was building real-time search analytics pipelines. And right now, I've moved to a dedicated team in my company, which is just doing one thing, covering all the API services that we provide with different programming languages. So we are building API clients in many different programming languages, including Go. So this is what we do. We are more or less 4 or 5 developers, and our team is responsible for building exactly the same project, but in different languages. As you may see, if you ever played with those different languages, there are some that are very high level, which provide a lot of features, whether some may not provide the same set of features, and especially Go, which is very minimal in that regard. But the goal is always the same. We want to provide exactly the same developer experience. So it means same feature set. Obviously, when we are fixing a bug, we are fixing it across all the API clients. And finally, we are also trying to stick to the idioms of each language. So you won't write Go code the way you write Scala code or JavaScript code. And this is the goal. Every time we write something, we write it in the way that is expected by the users of the language. Okay. enough about all programming languages. I promise I will stop there. So what are the expectations for your users? So just by show of hands, who is mainly writing libraries as his day job or day job? Okay, so for the rest of the room, you are mainly importing dependencies, right? Okay, so maybe you will agree with that. I think that as users, and I was mainly a user before, the thing that I care the most about my dependencies are security, stability, and performances. And I would even say in that order. So it's really subjective, but to me, when I import something, it can be performant, it's nice. It can be stable, it's nice. But if it's not secure, most probably I will look away from this dependency. So security is really important. Then comes stability, performance. Rank them the way you would like. On top of those expectations that are on the user side, I would say that as maintainers, so I'm just speaking for the 5 people in the room who raised their hands, you also have 2 more expectations that you should try to aim for. First of all, the compatibility. It's really nice to build new features to fix things in your libraries, but if for each version you are breaking the user code on the other side, it's the worst. For your users, they don't really care about what you are doing. If every time they update, you break their code, it's an issue. And I told you a bit already about that, but developer experience is really, really important. So it's not because we are writing the same API clients in different programming languages that we will write it the Java way in every single one or the Go way in every single one. All right. Now let's talk about how to counter the Go limitations. So if you don't like the word, think about the Go minimalism as maintainers. Again, this talk can apply to people that are not maintaining libraries. Huh? So we don't have function overload in Go. You may already know that. I hope so. But though, how do you add extra parameters without breaking the compatibility? So let's take an example. Let's say you are relying on the REST API or whatever that is providing CRUD operations. And this one is to save objects, a generic object. Let's not get into details here. Let's say that tomorrow, I don't only want to pass the objects to this method, but I also want to pass a new kind of options. So here, this is called request options. This is what we used to have in our code, but could be really anything else. Every time you want to add a new option to your function, because we don't have function overload in Go, you have to provide a new function with a new name. So this can be definitely cumbersome, because it also means that you have to maintain 2 functions now, and you also have to change the first code to handle this. Here you see that you can still reuse the same function to provide the functionality for the 2. The issue is that now you also have to do a bit of nil checking in that case, and it's a lot of maintenance in the end. But this is perfect, because you are completely okay with the breaking compatibility rule. You are not breaking user code in that regard. You are just adding new features, which means that the users that were relying on the previous method, the save objects one, they are still completely okay, but they can migrate whenever they want to the new one. It's also, you still have good discoverability. So most probably you are using an IDE or an editor that is properly configured that lets you find exactly the parameters that you should pass to your function. In that case, it's perfect because every single function has a dedicated types for each of its arguments, and it's super easy to provide auto-completion on that and these kind of things. However, you don't want to do that every time you implement a new parameter, so this can be an issue. Also, every single function, you have to replicate it. You have to see how to play with each function with the other ones to avoid to write the same code multiple times. So for a maintainer, it may be an issue. And finally, nil checks. So you have to provide nil checks everywhere. So it's not super bad, but still, it's something that you would like not to do. Also, because we don't have function overload, how do you plan for extra parameter? There is a second solution, actually. Imagine that now I'm providing this signature. So here, you will say that, okay, you are breaking the compatibility. Let's see that after. But do you agree that with this, I'm completely future-proof in that sense? Because now I'm expecting the actual objects that I will save, but I can also pass any kind of option afterwards, because here, for those who don't know, it's a variadic parameters that you can pass as empty interface, which means that you can pass 0 to n parameters of absolutely any type. It's completely future-proof. If you do that upfront instead of writing the first version of the save objects, you will have a single function to maintain nowadays. The variadic parameters, it makes them completely optional, meaning that your users can pass just the objects, or they can pass the extra options. And it's more work on the maintainer side. And here you see that I put a green check mark, and it's not an error. I really like this, because if I can do this work for my end users, it means that this is work that they don't have to do. And this is something that I maintain. And today, in our company, we have probably a few hundred or a few thousand of customers, relying on this library. It still means that I'm writing the code once, and they are using it for free. Two bad things, though. You have less discoverability, because now you can not know what to pass to the function just at looking at its signature. And also, if you want to introduce that, you need to break the compatibility, because if in the past you had just the save objects and you want to keep the same name, it means that you have to release a new major version. But keep in mind that if you are providing new features, this is a really cool pattern to have in the first place. For the discoverability, though, you will see in the next slide that there are solutions to help the users in the end. All right, fighting code duplication. So a very simple example that we have everywhere in our code base is that we have plenty of options that are holding a single value. So it may be an integer, a Boolean, a string, a slice of strings, or anything. They only own this value, and most of the time they just have JSON Marshall and Marshall methods attached to them. And sometimes they have comparison function, string function, something like that. But it's always the same, all right? Here is an example, so don't really look at the names, we don't really care here. But we have a settings tree that lets you configure the search indices in Algolia. And we have probably 60 or 70 fields like that. And all of them are written as an option. So here, I don't type them as this is a list of string, this is an integer, this is a Boolean. I'm really providing a wrapper type for every single one of them. You may think that this is super error prone, and you are totally right to write this multiple times. But we have a solution for that. So if you know Go Generate, it's a tool that is part of the Go command line tool that helps you generate code. So you may think of it as kind of a code generation tool that is not built in the compiler. Let's not talk about generics here, but this is the idea. You can just generate Go code out of some patterns. And I'll show you how we did it in our site. So in our code base, we have all those files. This is the only directory where we are generating code here. And I'll show you everything that we did. So we have those files. Every single one of those files is the main function that generates one or multiple files for our code base that are mostly the same. So for instance, you see the gen option one. This one is responsible for generating all the options I told you about earlier. Then we have some templates. So it's fairly easy. The main function I showed you, they are using the templates to generate the actual code that will end up in your code base. We also have an option file that is containing all of the data. So we load all the data we want to generate from this file, and a few helper functions that we put in a different file to share them among the different main files. And finally, we have this gen.go that is just writing, in which we just write the Go generate directives that runs the main files to generate the code. In our code base, this code, it accounts for less than 1,000 lines of code. But it's responsible for generating nearly 10 times more. And our total code base is probably just 16K lines of code, which means that more than half of our Go client is generated. All right. So it means that once you generate this code, it's completely tested, it completely works, and every time you fix something, you fix it in most of the generated code. So see, the error prone thing kind of disappears here. So the code is still readable, because the good thing is that once you use GoGenerate, you generate Go code, and after that you can just you can just run Go thumpt on it, which means that the code is just like if it was human written. So it's really good because once you have to read it, actually, it's the same as if you were reading human written code. It improves code reuse for sure, and it's absolutely sure that everything is tested because we are generating tests for them, and we're also having our end-to-end testing that is running on those options and those generating code. All right, let's talk about JSON fields now. So you may know that when you have a JSON payload, you may also receive from your API legacy JSON fields. Let's take this example. So we have a contact struct that only contains a single field, which is called name, and which serialize and deserialize from your payload from the same kind of object, JSON objects which just contain a name attribute with the string value. What's happening very often is that this JSON payload, you wake up on Monday morning and the rest of the core team is telling you, hey, by the way, the name, we will change it because it's not really clear whether it's the first name or the last name. So we'll rename it first name. Okay, right, great. So if you are writing on the maintenance of the Python, Ruby, JavaScript libraries, super easy. No problem, everything is done for the user. They have to check by themselves the type. For Go maintainers, for Scala maintainers, for Java maintainers, the issue is that now you have a field that is exported. So it's part of your public API. You cannot break the compatibility there. You cannot simply rename it. But still, you want for your users to have this propagated transparently for them. Here is the trick. So we keep the original struct. So I hope you see it. Can you see it in the back? Yeah. So you keep the original contact struct, but you will also produce a new one that is unexported and that will deserialize only the new format of the payload. So as you see, here I have the name field, but this one is only taking care of the first name attribute in the JSON payload. And it is unexported, so it's not part of your public API, right? Finally, when I unmarshal the payload on the exported type, the contact type with a capital letter, what will happen is that I will deserialize twice the payload, one time in the actual exported instance and one time in the unexported one, so which I call the legacy variable here. Finally, what you do is that if in the exported payload you don't have this field that is set, which means that the payload was containing the new format for the field, then I use the one from the new format and I insert it. All right. And this solution, keep in mind that it's completely not relying on any library. It's just a trick that we use internally, and we are not importing a big library to do that. All right. So maybe it's a bit messy, but it works, and you have no dependency for it. All right. Now, how do you deserialize a JSON payload which may contain unknown fields? Let me explain. So let's take the same example, the contact struct. On top of the actual known attributes, you also have some unknown attributes. So you may say that those you probably don't care about, but sometimes for your end users, they do care about those fields. Maybe it's a hidden property from our engine that is somewhere that is only used by some customers, some users, and you still want to export it. How do you do that with just the standard library? So the trick is to have a map that contains all the objects that you don't know about, or that you don't expect, or that you don't want to expose on your public API. And as you see, the JSON tag for this specific field is dash. So who knows what dash does in the standard library? All right. So dash, it simply means to the JSON deserializer, okay, when you see this field, don't try to deserialize it, okay? It's just an exported field, but don't try to do anything with it, which means that he's not looking for an unknown fields to do something here. Same thing. I build a type alias that is unexported on my type, and you will see after why. Okay, let's do it. So the trick here is to say, I will unserialize my payload into a variable of type contact unexported. Do you see why I do that? So the goal here is to say, I want to get all the attributes that I have in my payload in my known fields. So it should be done by the regular JSON and Marshall thing. Except that if I just call JSON and Marshall on the actual C variable directly without doing the typecast, what will happen is that I will re-enter indefinitely in the same unMarshall function. So the trick here is to just use a type alias to prevent this from happening. So I will just deserialize it once because there is a default unMarshall JSON function on the unexported contact variable. All right, I say it one more time. Here, on the contact unexported type, you have a default unMarshall JSON method. Okay, and this is the one that will be get called here. But still, the C variable is the one from my exported type, the one for which I'm writing the method right now. So I will put all the fields in this variable first. Then I will also unMarshall the payload, but this time in the map that you've seen earlier. So it means that now every single field will end up in the map. And finally, I just remove from the map that contains the unknown fields, the known fields. All right? And this is very convenient because now the users can use all the exported fields that are correctly typed. But in case they rely on unexported or unknown fields or anything, they still can access them through the map. All right? And again, here you see it's a bit of code. Maybe it may look messy, but in the end, you are not adding a new dependency for your end users. Everything is done with standard Go. All right, so enough complaining about Go minimalism. Let's talk about how to provide good DX, even if you're writing with a small language that doesn't provide all the expressiveness that you have in other programming languages. All right, good. So you already know this quote, but it really resonates to me. A little copying is better than a little dependency. So this is something I'm trying to do in the Go client that I'm writing, but it's also something that I'm trying to do in every single API client we ship and in all the open source libraries that we ship at my company. I'm really thinking that this is the good way of approaching things. Sometimes, as a maintainer, you should really think, should I really put that code that I don't maintain, that I'm not responsible for, that I'm not writing, into my end user's code? So my advice on this is really keep your dependency tree small. The lesser dependencies you have in your project, it means the less dependency you are importing in the end user's code. It may not sound like it's a big thing, but honestly, if you ever encountered any conflicts by importing libraries with your transitive dependencies, this is the worst to fix. So now the situation is a bit better thanks to Go modules and the minimum version selection that they are doing. But still, if you don't write the code, probably try to avoid to import someone else's code in your end user's code base, because at the end of the day, you will be responsible when there will be bugs. Also, the standard library is huge. So as you see, this library that we wrote, we just need the JSON serializer, deserializer. They are in the standard library. We need an HTTP client. It's in the standard library. And a few other utils functions, they are in the standard library. Like, for instance, we need the HMAC hashing functions. They are in the standard library. Thing is, by just relying on the standard library, we are not depending on anything else. And this one is a big dependency, okay? But this one is maintained, and it will continue to be maintained in the future. All right. What about user-defined objects? So this one is really interesting because a lot of people are thinking that we cannot really work without generics. So I'm one of the first to miss generics. When I did this presentation, this very presentation at my company while rehearsing it, my direct coworker who is working on C#, he was laughing at me when I told him that. But still, in Go, we don't have generics, but don't think that this is a reason for saying we cannot do the same thing as other languages. There are disadvantages of doing it, providing good and flexible public API for user-defined objects, but it's absolutely doable. Okay, let's do it one step by step. So remember this function that saves the objects. So the easiest way would be to just accept for objects, for user-defined objects, so object that you don't know at compile time, to accept a map, a list of maps, a slice of maps. This way, you can pretty much accept everything. It's perfect. The only issue here is that every time a user is having a slice of their own kind of objects, so slice of contacts, slice of employees, slice of anything, they will need to convert first to a map. So this is really cumbersome to just use your library. There are the contracts, but as you may know, they are not existing yet. We don't know. I would be obviously really happy to work with contracts when it will come out, if it will come out. But for now, it's not something we can use. There is something you can do. You can have a custom type or a custom interface that says, okay, every single thing that I'm accepting here is following this type or following this interface. In our case, the only thing that we are actually needing for our use case is to have every single object that expose an object ID attribute, which is a unique ID. So at first, we tried this approach. Thing is, it enforces the types, it's perfect. Internally, you know that you will have this object ID or the mandatory fields that you need in your own business logic. But for the users, it's exactly the same as the first step. It means that they have to convert all their objects to your object type, because it's not only because you are respecting the interface that it will work in that case, because here you are not accepting an interface, you are accepting a slice of interface, which changes the type. So you cannot pass a slice of contact, for instance, even though contact may implement the object interface. Last solution, okay, let's take a slice of empty interfaces. Empty interfaces should be able to accept anything. Wrong, for the exact same reason. Slice, the type slice of empty interface, it's a type on its own, which means that a slice of empty interface type is different from a slice of contact type, which is different of a slice of anything else type. All right? The only solution that you can rely on that is flexible for your users is this one. You want to pass objects that are user-defined. The only way of doing it is to accept the empty interface. Cool thing with this, you can accept objects, you can accept slice, you can accept maps, you can accept channels, you can accept whatever you want. Isn't it perfect? Problem is no discoverability at all. So you don't know, your users don't know what they should pass. So in that case, maybe it's obvious. You are just expecting them to pass a slice of objects, of their own objects, easy to do. But when the functions are a bit less obvious in the naming, it may be confusing. All right, let's talk about variadic parameters now. So you remember that I told you to have a good and future-proof API, you could pass save objects, you could accept variadic parameters, variadic empty interface to your thing. But I told you this is an issue for discoverability. Here, when I do this function call, it's super easy because you see that my saveObject method, it can accept the objects. And as variadic parameters, I can pass the context, extra headers, anything. But here, the discoverability is not clear because those are the variable names. I could have totally named extra header an integer or CTX. What tells you that CTX is actually a context just by looking at the function call? It's even worse when our users are doing that. They are calling the search method on the index. So search is probably the search query. Then, what is it? So it's absolutely not clear when we are providing this. There is something that is convenient, and here you may see why I introduced the option types earlier, which is to wrap every single value in its own type. So it doesn't force the type, so you cannot just look at the function signature and detect what you can pass. But still, for the end users, when they look at their own code, they clearly see what they are passing. So here I completely understand that I'm passing an option, which is an integer value, which is called its per page. This is the wrapper type that we are using, and this is the actual code that we generate. It's just a wrapper type on top of a value, which is an integer, and you have a kind of a constructor on top of it, and it does the job. I haven't written all the JSON Marshall and Marshall thing, but you may understand this is pretty obvious implementation. This is called functional options, or function options, I don't recall. It was written on some people from the Go team a long time ago. I think it was Dave Cheney who coined the term. It's really convenient because now you are producing, you are adding semantic to your API, to your public API. And you can still write JSON serializer and deserializer for a very specific type. So it's very convenient. However, you have a lot of code duplication because of that, but we already answered this by using GoGenerate. All right, let's finish by talking about channels. So you may all like channels because it's a very good and expressive way of dealing with concurrent code. I myself used them a lot in the past, not only because I was forced to by the GCP dependencies at the time, but also because they are really convenient, especially when you are building real-time analytics pipeline. Like you have plenty of use cases to write concurrent code. But as a library maintainer, so when you are shipping code for other people, I think those set of rules should help you to provide a good API without putting your users in a bad situation. So it's very easy to lock your user code with contention, just because you are introducing channels. Because you never know how they will use them. You never know if they will close them. You never know if they will just push too many data in your channels or read it too fast. There are plenty of reasons that their code could break just because you are introducing channels. So maybe if you can do it without using channels, it could be a good idea. One rule that I'm using, and I completely understand if you don't agree with this one, but from my experience, try to avoid to provide channels on your public API. So don't try to accept channels just for the sake of it, or don't return channels and expect the end user to close them or use them properly. They won't use them properly for sure at some point. So if you can avoid it, if it's not really a mandatory specification of your API, your public API, don't expose channels. The rule that I'm using, and this one, Roberto told about it yesterday during his closing talk, and it really resonates to me. The rule that I'm using internally for us is when you do have a need for channels internally, you make the channel, you use it, and you close it in the same function scope. This is a very good rule because you know that every time you enter a function, even though you have concurrency under the hood, you are completely sure that at the end of the function call, everything is finished and you don't have channels that are hanging around. All right, few takeaways. So I hope that you learned that it's really important to be pragmatic when you are exposing your code in thousands of code bases all around the world. So because Go is not very expressive, always plan for backward compatibility. I would argue that having ugly code, ugly JSON code, ugly standard code in general is better than having a dependency. Don't forget that you can always build business logic without generics. Probably it's not good for performances. Probably it's not super appealing to do so. But still, it's really important to understand that you are not blocked by the language. You can do pretty much everything that you want without generics anyway. So just focus on the business logic and find ways to do it anyway. Don't repeat to yourself. GoGenerate is very well documented. It's really easy to use once you get it. So don't hesitate to use it. It's one of the best options today to avoid to repeat yourself. Add semantic to your public API. So whether by using functional options or anything else that adds some semantic to your public API. And finally, but this is the last one, so you probably remember, use channels sparingly. So if you want to follow me or see the client, I should put the slide later. I'm ASEURE on Twitter and everywhere else. Thank you for your attention. Do you have any questions?